The Esya Centre hosted a roundtable discussion with Professor Christopher Yu, the Imasogie Professor in Law and Technology and the founding director, Center for Technology, Innovation and Competition at the University of Pennsylvania on July 19th. The discussion focused on the topic of emerging trends in antitrust. Professor Yu presented his research and findings on two emerging trends. Firstly, the move away from ex post antitrust evaluations in digital markets towards ex ante approaches. And secondly, the growing doctrinal overlap between antitrust and other legal areas such as data protection and copyright enforcement.
Thank you. So, I mean, I was in thinking about what would be helpful for this conversation. I have sort of four topics I'd like to address briefly. One is to give impact. One of the interesting things is we now have the opening months of implementation of the Digital Markets Act. And so we're starting to see some real world implications. One, for the implications for MSMEs, which I've known from all the addresses that we've heard is critical for India, but frankly for every country in the world, the backbone of every economy. But also, the future really depends on innovation, and we're learning more about what the DMA and how it's playing out in that way. And as was mentioned in the initial presentation, there are always unintended consequences, and we're actually finding out what some of them are. Second, there is a debate over ex-ante regulation. When do you do it and when do you don't? And there are legal frameworks. And one of the things that I think is useful with the adding to this debate is to think about, go to the scholarship that's looked at when that you can use as guidelines, heuristics. When is ex-ante regulation the right move? And are those circumstances really present here? And this is making a natural candidate. I'd like to briefly introduce you to what other countries are doing, because in a lot of the discourses, there's a lot of attention on the DMA, but actually it's only one of several different experiments going on right now. And then lastly, because of the second major question that Megan asked me to address, I'll offer some thoughts on intersectionality with respect to copyright and privacy. All right, starting first on the early feedback on the impact of the DMA. So, first and foremost, what's fascinating is it's had a next slide, surprisingly negative impact on small and medium-sized enterprises. Particularly, we've seen this in hotels, airlines, and local merchants. And one of the things that's happened is the Google search engine is actually the changes that the Google's had to make to their search engine to respond to the requirements of the DMA, according to studies, has dropped traffic to hotel websites by 30%. And dropped bookings by 36%. And there's several studies recapitulating this. What's happening instead? The search results are prioritizing intermediaries, online aggregators like Booking.com and Expedia. So the traffic is going more and more to them, and of course the hotels have to pay them a fee of a commission for those aspects. And if you would hit the next button, what you've seen is a wide range of trade associations throughout the travel industry have lodged complaints. Politicians have begun to raise concerns. And this is sort of the surprising unintended consequence. You know, my understanding is one of the things that Google had previously done is, and does in the other areas of the world, is that they believe that their consumers are very frustrated when you click on a link and it gives you another list of links. You know, you end up with people who don't have content of their own. You're linking to people who simply aggregate other people's content. They would tend to deprioritize them, because they thought that that's not what consumers want. And we've all been in that sort of situation where you click on this, you get a bunch of links, you click on that, you get another bunch of links, and it's just very frustrating. The DMA's the non-self-preferencing and the restrictions on being able to curate their feed has limited their ability to do this. And so consequently, they have to follow whatever the results come up, and it's creating opportunities for these aggregators. The other part about this is in innovation, and your timing's perfect. It's not just on SMEs. The fascinating thing is what's happening on innovation. So one of the things that we're seeing now is Google had changed its search results landing page to incorporate functions more than just listing links. And so what I'm having here, for those of you who are too far away to see it, this is a search for Hotels Madrid. So it doesn't just give you the hotel links, it gives you the maps so you see where they are. And if there's a bar above the maps where you can put in specific dates, it'll tell you availability, how many rooms you want, whether you want breakfast, different click down things you can do. And all of this was very, very attractive to consumers. It really increased their functionality. It's a form of innovation that went beyond what Google once did, if you would. This is what their website, their search results look like now in Europe. Why? Because the innovation they did on the left was an integration with Google Maps and Google functionality in the travel space. So Google Flights and Google and their hotel properties. And because of the incorporation of Google Maps into this result was invalidated under the DMA as a form of self-preferencing. They're preferring their maps over other people's maps. And this really brings in the insight that, in fact, there are some innovations that are combinations of functions and that we can see that are very, very good for consumers. Under conventional competition law, we've had generally evolved from a posture of extreme hostility towards vertical integration in the 1960s to an understanding that, in fact, it's ambiguous and is often beneficial. And we, under US law, have taken out ex-ante prohibitions one at a time and put it into the effects-based analysis in a way that India has done as well. It's very consistent with this. Unfortunately, by taking a non-effects-based approach and blanketly prohibiting self-preferencing, you go from the results on the left, which everyone likes, to the results on the right, which nobody likes. And so unfortunately, without having more nuanced understandings of when this is good and when it's bad, you're losing something. That's about existing innovations, if you would. Next, what about new innovations? So what we're finding out is the restrictions, the difficulty in complying with them has caused either delays or a complete refusal to roll out certain innovations that are happening in other countries. So in terms of delays, it's clear Meta Threads was delayed several months by inability to comply with the DMA. It's a new, as you probably know, messaging capability, social networking function to try to replace the collapse of Twitter. Elon Musk has had a magic touch in a lot of businesses, but as far as we can tell, he took Twitter and cut its value in half or less. But perhaps even more troublingly, Microsoft Copilot, which is their AI-based search function, and Apple AI have actually not launched in Europe because they are unable to comply with the DMA. And in fact, we're seeing that as a major issue if you hit the next button. And what we're seeing is you see statements from entrepreneurs and those who fund the entrepreneurs, including people who have successfully started businesses in Europe before, saying, we're not doing it anymore. In fact, they're seeing limitations on growth, and they're getting very concerned. And if you hit it one more time, there's a wonderful quote by the CEO of Ericsson, obviously a European equipment manufacturer, who's warned that overregulation may turn Europe into a museum. That is a place where old things that were interesting in the past live and nothing that matters today. And this is a fascinating thing to me, which is I think many people ignore compliance costs. And in fact, that particularly those costs hit particularly heavily on new innovators. And that's an enormous burden that they have. The quote I love is there's an entrepreneur I was talking to, and they said, I'm a dreamer. And if you make me hire a bunch of lawyers before I can start a new business, I'll keep dreaming. I'll just do it someplace else. And so there's a whole question about, in fact, in a world where capital is extremely mobile and we see globalization and competitiveness of each individual nation's companies is critical, we have to take a more nuanced understanding of that there are consequences to these sorts of regulation. All right. So that's what I'd say about innovation, and what we should always be aware that there's a trade-off. I mean, the funny thing that I love is when people reduce things to very limited ideas, the most interesting policy issues always involve trade-offs, and trying to understand what the forces are on both sides are things that policy analysts can help with and help resolve. So for the goal of the DMA to make things more contestable is quite admirable, and I understand where they're coming from, but we do have to understand that there is consequences to that. So as we've talked about, there's implications for innovation. We've already seen them in deploying it, and bundling and combining new things into new functions. I'm always inspired by Clayton Christensen, the late Harvard Business School professor, who believes that innovation actually is not patents anymore. It's not new science. It's often new business models. Putting things together that already exist in ways that are creating new benefits. And we also are aware that, in fact, all rules create winners, losers, as well as winners. I mean, and we have to understand, and you had in Google a case where their interest was getting as many clicks as possible, and in that sense, their interests were pretty well aligned with consumers, giving the people what they want, and that's the leverage we use in economics. It's not always perfect, and we tweak it when it's not. But in some sense, by disabling them from acting in certain ways, we actually lose some of that leverage and some of that benefit. And we see that, in fact, we get rules, and anyone who knows search engine optimizations also, all rules get gamed. And it's the wealthy ones that get gaming it, and it's kind of problematic. I think compliance cost is something that I always focus on. I love, the easy example for me is not actually from the DMA, but GDPR. Thanks to GDPR, we have to do opt-in consent instead of opt-out. We have to click OK a lot more. As far as I can tell, it's had created just burdens on everybody and has not changed privacy one iota. And so the funny thing is, I always tell the problem with compliance, you can always do more transparency, more. The problem is we have to ask about optimality, which is the marginal benefit of throwing more on there. You can always throw more on. The problem is you have to have some metric for saying when you say when. When the benefits of an additional requirement isn't worth the costs. Startups, actually, there's a huge problem with, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, about the quantitative approach, is that when you hit the ceiling, you can actually have a problem where all of a sudden you go from being unregulated to regulated. And so you get a penalty on overall innovation that if you're too successful, you pay a penalty. But not only that, you would expect companies to know those limits and to react accordingly, either to fragment their businesses or limit their growth in ways. And what I've learned from the Indian situation, in fact, the way we count those limits is actually not even service specific, it's company specific. So even if you're not dominant in any one sector, you may actually hit the thresholds in ways that actually I don't think are going to help anyone. It's not a meaningful benefit to consumers. And as I mentioned briefly in our pre-conversation, there's a growing awareness in Europe of that the remedies are going to be much more difficult than they imagined. I mean, I think that they analogize this all to telecom law, and I hear great statements like, data portability, that's easy. Anyone who works with data understands that Google and Facebook provide data portability now. In fact, nobody uses it. Why? Because all the data is configured in a different way, and that's part of the innovation. So the only way it's going to work is if a regulator then mandates the format for all the data that's going to be ported around, which is one, really expensive because data reconfiguration is almost unmanageable. Two, we'll create winners and losers based on the one you pick. Three, we'll lock it into bureaucratic processes that these things will change. And four, to me, the data structure, when you looked at this from I'm a computer science professor as well as a law professor, the structure of the data determines its functionality. And so if you require them to configure it in certain ways, you're actually foreclosing certain types of innovation and preferencing others in ways that are going to vanish out from under you while you're not looking. And so I think that there's always the other side we have to think about, and I think that's a side that I think that we need to be bringing in this conversation. All right. The other thing that always bugs me is that, in fact, I think that the current approach in the DMA, by looking at numbers that is currently in the draft proposal, represents a step backwards, both from the learnings of US competition law and Indian competition law. So back in the day, we used to look at market structure. If you were a big market share, we did something called the structure, conduct, performance paradigm. We said certain market structures inevitably lead to certain conduct, and that inevitably leads to bad performance. And so all we have to do is look at the market structure, and we can just infer the rest. And in fact, by the way, we didn't care what your conduct was, just cared if you were big. We have now abandoned that, and India has too. Why? Because economists realized over time that in fact, large share can be a misleading indicator of success. Why? We find that there are large firms, and this is for those of us who know the economics, contestable markets theory tells you that if entry and exit are extremely easy, potential competition can be a discipline in ways that are not visible in the market itself. And so you can't just look at the existing market share. The flip side, Stackelberg price leadership and other theories of dominant firm behavior tell you that even firms with very small market share can cause markets to behave in a very anti-competitive way. So looking at these thresholds is a terrible idea. Second, scale economies end up being much more important than the Joe Bain and Ed Mason original Harvard School thought. They thought that they were never important, and we're learning that even in the 60s and 70s, the studies showed that they're very important, and whatever we learned back then, they're even more important today. And I think that's absolutely critical to understand. Third, we've learned that we, as I mentioned, move from hostility to vertical integration to a growing awareness that can be beneficial. What I love is there's one of the lit reviews of the peer-reviewed literature on vertical integration was done by Francine Lafontaine and Margaret Slade. Francine LaFontaine was the chief economist for the Federal Trade Commission during the latter half of the Obama administration. And she wrote this study that they looked at the 25 peer-reviewed studies, our gold standard for what's good scholarship, which did a full welfare assessment of different types of vertical integration across a wide range of industries. What they found out that there was only one case in which vertical integration was harmful. The other 24 cases either beneficial or neutral, and the one that was harmful was on the order of, I think, 1.3% a year. It was a fairly small effect. And she wrote, I didn't expect this. I didn't go in thinking this, finding this result, but she said, we should not be making vertical integration per se illegal. And to the extent to which we have regulations, and we do in media regulation and other things, and telecom regulation that used to do that, she thinks that this is a bad idea and is not going to benefit consumers. And so it's part of consistent with the shift in US competition law. All vertical restraints and vertical integration have now shifted to a rule of reason approach instead of a per se ex ante rule approach. And that the other thing, and this is perhaps the most important one, being a dominant firm could be the result of anti-competitive activity, but can also be the result of successful competition on the merits. And going back to Alcoa in the 1920s, the US leading case, they said, the successful competitor, having been invited to compete, cannot be turned upon if it wins. Why? Because if that's going to happen, they'll make the assessment. It's going to, am I going to take this innovation? Am I going to invest? Am I going to take a chance on this new business? I'll calculate what my costs are, and I'll think about, here's my expected value. There's failure and there's success, and if I succeed, I'll get X. Well, if you get penalized by doing too well, it's now X minus something. And on the margin, you're going to see a deterrent to innovation, and especially when you see successful companies who've simply built the proverbial bet on mousetrap, really have done something, and in fact they're sustained is because they're reinvesting in R&D and continuing doing things. By not actually paying attention to the conduct, you lose that. So that's why competition law, modern competition law, doesn't just look at share, they look for what we call some exclusionary conduct, some anti-competitive action, and we've always said around the world, mere size is not enough. The problem I have with the DMA is even though everyone says structuralism is, the conventional wisdom was wrong, because we're going to lose these benefits, they're going back to structuralism without an explanation of what their arguments are, answering why we moved away from it in the first place. At a minimum, we have to get in a serious argument to say, okay, we had these other concerns. Are they no longer important in the modern economy? Are they, something changed, or do we have a new learning? There may be answers to those questions, but we're not really asking them now, and I think that's a huge problem. All right, if you would, next slide. So the other thing is, when we think about this, I talked about innovation and how we think about things. I do think that the scholarship gives us some guides on when to use ex ante regulation. So what's interesting, I'm really drawing on something all competition lawyers know about, which is the distinction between per se illegality and rule of reason. And there's also a legal literature, academic literature on what we call rules versus standards. The classic rule would be something like drive 100 kph. A standard would be drive reasonably in light of the circumstances, and the funny thing is, a lot of people think, oh, standards are what we do and we don't know very much, and they all evolve into rules. That's actually not the case. You see, within law, most accident law, what we call torts, continues to be standards, even though we're centuries into common law of where we are. Apparently, there are areas of regulation which are of the nature that we just will never make rule-like behavior. And we'll never regulate them with rule-like principles. So why? What we learn from both those literatures is that the reason when you do use rules is when, first, you have enough experience with the subject. So the problem with rules, they always say that rules are very expensive to draft but cheap to enforce. Standards are really easy to draft, be reasonable, but they're extremely expensive to enforce. And so the problem is, if you're going to do the drafting up front, you have to really know the subject matter to be able to do it right. There's actually a dimension of this is how often you can enforce it. So like if the only reason you take the fixed costs of actually setting up the rules in advance is if you're going to do it over and over and over again. And I would say with competition law, we're going to do a fair number of cases, but not like, it's not like speeding. It's not like that. But the second is, you have to have, the subject matter has to be susceptible to simple policy inferences. I mean, they always say in the literature, you declare something per se illegal when it's so clearly harmful that nothing is lost by prohibiting it outright. And even if there's a small number of cases where it might be beneficial, the game's not worth the candle. Just don't bother. And if you have a simple practice like that, we ban it and we call it per se illegal. The classic one we have in competition law is price fixing. There is no real efficiency benefits or arguments for price fixing, and we say if you're fixing prices, don't have to do the effects analysis, that's fine. If it's not susceptible to simple policy inferences, you don't make ex ante rules. And for things like vertical integration, which is the primary role that the DMA is getting at, this is the perfect candidate for doing case-specific work and not rules. The other thing is the subject matter has to be homogeneous. You have to have recurring fact patterns. So even within like accident law, which is governed by reasonableness, if you're in a car accident where the guy behind you rear ends your car, we know who's liable. It's the guy behind you. So I mean, there are things that we can learn and we create them because they're stable and we get that. Now, if it's some other more complex situation, we have to do the whole analysis. And so what we learned is that the subject matter, the reason it's persisted is because of the nature of it. But the other thing is, because you write a rule and it gets fixed, you have to be, the rate of change matters. So if there's a lot of internal innovation within the industry and you create a rule, it's going to become obsolete. And in fact, it's going to be, you have to update it, which for rule of law purposes is going to take 6 months at the most because you have to have consultations and comments and all these other things. But also we are acutely aware, for example, new ventures tend to be underrepresented in political processes and regulatory processes. Why? They don't have revenue yet. And in fact, what you'll tend to see is established players participate in that in a way. And I'm not saying they've got to represent their interests. I'm not saying that makes them evil, but we can systematically understand how these processes are going to play out in ways. And not only the internal environment, the external environment. You know, what I love is, you know, AI went off like a bang like last year. I haven't seen anything that caused the entire academy to lose its mind simultaneously like OpenAI. And that clearly is a game changer. I mean, we see this. And so, for example, OpenAI may be revolutionizing search. Search used to be done based on prior search data. So if you didn't have a body of search, you couldn't do it. They're now replacing search often with AI, either to supplement it, or some people are actually not even searching at all. They're going straight to AI. AI is trained on publicly available data scraped from the internet. And so the basis for competition and all this has really changed based on something exogenous to the network, to the businesses altogether. And if you're in a world like that, relying on ex-ante rules is really, really a bad approach, is what the scholarship tells us to do. And this provides us heuristics and frameworks we can then look into a debate, which India is having right now, and ask, is ex-ante regulation as the intervention fit for purpose for the environment in which it's being applied? And I think that's a great way to think about it. All right, if you would. Then lastly, to bring us out, I wanted to diversify the idea because it's more than just the DMA, if you would again. So for example, one of the fascinating things is Germany actually has adopted a law that stays within the competition law framework, made some adjustments to burdens of proof and presumptions. And it's really fascinating because that actually implements something called the new competition tool. When Margaret Vestager started this, she commissioned 3 scholars, 1 economist, 1 lawyer, 1 computer scientist, to write a report. And they endorsed this idea of doing it within conventional competition law. And what you see in the EU, and I said it reflects its own circumstances and political dynamics, one of the things that they've got, one of the issues is first, their business environment is very different from India's. EU wishes they had a Flipkart, they don't. But the second thing is, they were all set to write the new competition tool into law. And then France Telecom, now Orange, French telecom, the European telecom industry, and Axel Springer, a German content company, went to Vice President of the EU, Thierry Breton, who's a former CEO of France Telecom, and lobbied him to make a change, and 2 weeks later, the DMA draft hits. And so what we see is a political dynamic which I think it's important for you to understand when you decide whether you want to emulate this or not. Both in terms of they're providing more and more access to the existing facilities without paying attention to innovation because they're not really, they haven't been able to do that. And Germany is more faithful to what they're doing, and they're implementing their law. It actually was in the head of the DMA. Japan did a market study and decided they didn't need to do the DMA for most of the sectors. They're doing one just for the app OS environment. Korea considered legislation and rejected it last year in the face of pretty strong objections from both not only large companies in Korea, but also small and medium-sized enterprises. There's some indications with the legislature changing hands that they may come up again, but they didn't. The UK has gone a very different direction. They're actually favoring codes of conduct as opposed to the DMA style. And I noted that in the preview, you mentioned the U.S. started consider regulation and legislation. There was a chance we would have done it last Congress. Any of us will tell you it has no chance of passing now, because the Republican House, the Republicans took over the House, and the new chair of the House Judiciary Committee has said this is dead. So yes, every time you get elections, I mean, you know this here, everything can change. But in fact, none of us really expect this to happen in there. And so what I would say is that, in fact, that it's, the DMA is an important model and something that you're considering, but it's only one of many. And I think that I would encourage you to think about the strengths and the weaknesses and find look at this plurality of approaches and figure out the ones that's fit for purpose for India, because it's a very different business environment. It's a much more innovative business environment. It's a much more vibrant one. You're in a different stage of the development ladder. And you have to make sure you make sense with what you're going to do. The last thing I'll talk about intersectionality, and I have to commit, I'll say it, you'll see on the next slide, I'm an intersectionality skeptic. And if you would, so what's interesting is I often hear people say, oh, we should use antitrust to do many, many things. So we should do it for wealth redistribution and have this all, we should use it to do democracy. I was talking with Professor Gupta, we should do it for gender. Well, I mean, we analyze this, but I mean, it's not the best tool for doing certain things. It's just not, and what it's good at is markets, making markets work. And the funny thing is, what I was taught by my own professor, it's not a business etiquette statute. So in other words, a person, what the example I give is, suppose I was taught, suppose you don't like your competitor, I actually bomb their factory, okay? I probably committed a business tort. I've certainly committed a crime. But have I committed an antitrust violation? The answer is no, unless it hurts the market. And if there were 10 other factories out there, the market will be just fine. The other example I was taught, when I was living in Cincinnati working for Procter & Gamble, there were two brothers that ran a diner, and they got into a fight. So one moved across the street and started his own diner. He got chucked out of the business. He cut prices 10%. Brother retaliated, cut prices 10% below him, and over and over and over again. They beat the crap out of each other. Very bad for them. Wonderful for all of us. This is price competition. This is exactly what we want to have happen. This is not about moderating, behavior. This is about looking at markets and seeing what happens. And yes, certain things can affect markets that are at this level, but it has to be systematic enough to where you worry about that. So otherwise, garden variety disputes over everything become antitrust cases. And in the US, that means it's in federal court, it gets treble damages, all these other things that go along with it. That doesn't make any sense. So when I think about the French copyright case, copyright law has statutory damages in the US. It's a big stick. And injunctive relief in ways that can block. So the idea that if AI is violating copyright law, and there's a very credible argument that it is, both in terms of yielding outputs that infringe it and also using inputs that in ways that infringe, the natural thing is to first instance let copyright law handle this and wait and see if that remediates it. And if there's a problem, maybe there's some room for competition law. Frankly, I'm skeptical, especially because copyright law, intellectual property works by giving people exclusive control in ways that create the ability to make super competitive returns, above marginal cost returns. That's the whole point of driving innovation. So you have to be very careful about bringing in antitrust law to say, oh, you're making more than cost. Well, guess what? That was the whole point. And so we have to be a little careful. I don't like the German Facebook case. I know it went through their court of law, their final decision, but the bottom line is, the reality is they have pretty effective privacy laws, and if someone's violating privacy, they should be sanctioned under privacy law. Now, the little story under this is that if you start to bring in privacy, you're going to get turf wars between agencies about who's going to handle things. And the thing that, I don't know if this is true in India, but in the US, it's not just at the agency level, it's also at the legislative level. Because different committees run different agencies, and they want their agency to be the one. So privacy and e-commerce are done by different agencies, different committees. They like the political donations they get and the attention, and you're going to get this whole this war. If you want to understand really what the German Facebook case was, Andreas Mundt was facing a real debate within Germany that they were going to set up a new digital regulator. And he didn't want that to happen because all of a sudden he loses his turf. And so he wanted to show the world that the Bundeskartellamt can handle this in ways by stretching the law in ways that I think they should have just let the privacy regulator find them. And in fact, there's a general problem that we have in Europe. The other problem is they've got these laws, but they don't actually enforce them. But that's a whole different matter. But I mean, the answer is the solution even then is not to then turn to another agency, but to actually enforce your privacy laws and to make that more robust. So I'm a skeptic. I'm happy to have that conversation. Okay, and so to sum up, what I would say is that in fact, there are unintended consequences to every intervention. And we're learning from DMA what they are for SMEs, for innovation, and for consumers. And there's this wonderful quote that I love from Fred Jani, who's the chair of the OECD's competition committee, and he's not a friend of the DMA. And so, you know, this is, we were talking earlier about are all Europeans in favor of this? He says it can, ex ante regulation can be anti-economic.